Well, thank you very much, everybody. I really appreciate it. Let me get my PowerPoint up here so I can share this with you all.
Did you go?
Oh, I need permission to share, please, from the host.
Sorry.
There we go.
God.
No problem.
You should
No
have it
problem
now.
at all. No problem at all. Okay, can everyone see?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. All right, so I believe I have about 15 minutes. So until about 5 minutes before 7 p.m. and then we'll have time for question and answer. So I really appreciate the invitation to speak with you all again. It's hard to find any good things to say about the pandemic, but I will say that being able to meet online and having lots of folks get more familiar with that has certainly been helpful and important in order to stay connected. So I really appreciate that your organization and the congregation there with the Unitarians is always interested in this issue, wants further updates. So it's nice to see you all and to be able to do this even if we can't travel safely right now. So as Mohammed said, I'm the managing attorney of the Farm Worker Program at Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid. It's a nonprofit that represents many people with limited incomes. So the overview presentation that I have, I'll try and not speak too quickly, but I want to give you all as much information as possible, is first to give you some context to what the organization is that I represent and how it relates to the other organizations that are involved in representing and assisting migrants along the border and then throughout Texas. And I'll provide you all an update on the quote unquote migrant protection protocols, what's changing under the Biden administration and what the current conditions are in the refugee camp there in Matamoros, Mexico, on the other side of Brownsville. And then I also wanted to take some time to speak with you all about issues that affect migrants once they're inside the United States, specifically issues that are impacting farm workers now in the state of Texas. And that includes how workers are dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, how they're dealing with the storm that just occurred a little bit more than a week ago, and then talk about some opportunities for legislative advocacy if you are interested, that are going to be coming up in the Texas legislature, because I know that you all have been interested on housing issues in the past. And if there's time, I'll give you all some descriptions of some other advocacy that we've been working on, because I think it's really interesting and exciting. But let's just go ahead and get started. So what is legal aid and who is TRLA? Well, again, TRLA is a nonprofit organization. We're a law firm. We're actually one of the largest law firms in Texas, but we are partly funded by the federal government and partly funded by the state, and as well as private contributions, individual donations. And the concept behind legal aid generally nationally is to provide for people with civil issues. So not for criminal issues, that's the public defender, but for people with civil issues, some right to counsel so that they can access our legal system. The reason being that without equal access to the law, the system not only robs poor people of their only protection, but it actually places it in the hands of their oppressors, the most powerful and ruthless weapon ever created. So our organization isn't just about getting people access to the legal system, it's also about reforming the legal system and how poor people are treated within it. That's a little bit of background into our organization. Like I said, we are funded most largely by the Legal Services Corporation, which was established in the 1970s. It's an outgrowth of the Office of Economic Opportunity, which was itself established in the 60s as part of Johnson's War on Poverty, back when we had wars on poverty. So this organization is an outgrowth of that. Again, we focus on civil matters, and in order for people to be eligible for our representation, they have to meet certain federally dictated and state dictated criteria, one of which is that people's household income be at no more than 25% above the federal poverty level, or if they are up to 200% of the poverty level, so they earn twice as much as someone deemed poor under the federal poverty guidelines, they have to meet some kind of additional exception, like an extenuating circumstance. But most migrants and farm workers that we represent are well below even the federal poverty level. There's really no need for a discussion above because they're so underpaid and sporadically employed and excluded from so many workforces. So most of our clients not only are poor per the federal poverty guidelines, but really, really, really poor. They don't make minimum wage, for example, which is $7.25 an hour. And unfortunately, one of the benefits of having stable and reliable funding is that the government gets to dictate the terms. So our specific organization is subject to restrictions with respect to the representation of immigrants. There are some exceptions for people who are abused, people who are refugees or could apply for refugee status or asylee status. But for the average person who is undocumented, they unfortunately are not eligible for our services per the dictates of the federal government. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about is collaborations that folks in my organization do on their private time, or ways in which we support other organizations that don't have those restrictions. So some of this work that I'm going to discuss is what we're doing directly with TRLA, Texas Railroad on Illegal Aid, and others of it are more about the folks with whom we collaborate, since we all try and coordinate and engage in wraparound services. So just to give you all an idea, here in the US, a household of one is considered poor, meaning they are 100% of the poverty level. They are federally legally poor if for 1 year they earn a total gross of $11,490. Many of our clients have numerous children, household average of 4, for example. You qualify for our services if you earn less than $30,000 a year for a family of 4, and will not qualify for our services if you earn more than $47,100. So again, very, very poor. And the number of people who nonetheless are eligible for our services in Texas is roughly 1 attorney per every 20,000 poor people. So even though, yeah, I saw someone's eyes get big. Yes, yes. So we advise or represent approximately between 20,000 and 30,000 people a year, but it is still nowhere near the demand. So as I said, one of the impacts of being federally funded by the Legal Services Corporation is we can't provide services to a number of people who are immigrants or migrants, including a lot of people who are undocumented, unless they fall into some kind of an exception, like being eligible for protection under the Violence Against Women Act, or for applying for a U visa or a T visa. T visas are for potential victims of human trafficking. U visas are for people who are victims of a crime or witnesses to a crime. We're also not allowed to bring class action litigation, so we can sue the government, but the government will not fund us to sue them, including on a class basis. Other organizations which exist in Texas, but which are much, much smaller because they have much less funding, don't receive those federal funds and don't have these restrictions, but of course they really struggle for funding and therefore for personnel. So one thing just to put on your radars in general context for this conversation is, now that the Biden administration is in place, one of the things federally that may come up is a discussion in Congress on whether to lift the funding restrictions on the federal funds that we receive to allow us to represent the undocumented, or more specifically, to remove the restriction that prevents us from using any funds that we collect to represent people who are undocumented or don't fall into one of these exception categories. because not only is there a restriction with respect to the federal funds, but that is actually a poisonous restriction, which restricts all of the other funds that we receive. So there's, yes, a national conversation that's now going on about whether, even if it's not politically palatable, to remove the restrictions against the representation of undocumented people generally, whether we could remove the restriction on the remainder of our funds, especially since various organizations, including ours, have substantial revenue separate and apart from that. So that's just a national issue that's floating out there that you all might hear about. And if you do, and if you support access to legal aid for people, it would be good to speak to your representative about and weigh in on. So as I said, we're part of a network of organizations that exist in every state. This is our website, trla.org. So we have a lot of resources up there for the community. A lot of what we've been doing during the pandemic has been community education online, and we have a lot of fact sheets and the like on various topics there that you all might find interesting, especially if you know someone in the community, for example, that needs help with rent assistance, or information about the moratorium on the federal moratorium on evictions, because we represent not just immigrants or migrants, but people of all walks of life on family law issues, consumer law issues, et cetera. And if someone needs a referral to another state or a different part of Texas, there's the link on where you could refer them there. So that's the context behind how it is that I come to you all and how it is that I know this information, why I'm residing in Rio Grande Valley, where our organization is based. Our main office is in Mercedes, Texas, which is in between McAllen, which is the sister city to Reynosa, Mexico, and in between Brownsville, which is the sister city to Matamoros, Mexico, which I know that you all are very, some of you all are very familiar with. So I've been here approximately 9 years, although I grew up in El Paso on the border. And as I said, we collaborate with a lot of different organizations. So what has changed now that the Biden administration is in place? Well, this information I obtained from a colleague of mine by the name of Susan Law. Susan used to be the HR director for about 35 years, if not more, for our organization, Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid. And previous to that, she was an organizer and the spouse of one of the founders of the Texas Farm Worker Union. So Susan retired about 2 or 3 years ago, about the same time when my other colleague, Jennifer Harbury, who spoke to you all with me in September of 2019, retired. And Susan and Jennifer are some of the Angry Tias and Abuelas who founded that organization and have been very involved in responding to the refugee crisis. So Susan and I had a conversation about what's going on as of last Thursday. And here are some of the things that she explained. With respect to the camp there in Matamoros and the ability to cross, the camp right now is presently being run, if you can call it that, by a Mexican government agency called the IMP. You know, when I asked Susan, well, who's in charge of the camp right now or who's running it? She's like, I don't really know what to say because there's nobody who's really tried to take responsibility for it or wanted to take responsibility for it. But she said, if I had to designate somebody, it's probably the Mexican agency, the IMP, which governs migratory issues and has controlled access to the camp as far as who can come in and who can come out. And that's what's occurred since the pandemic. She says that the UNHCR is also there and they are facilitating this pre-screening or clearance process that is happening in conjunction with Customs and Border Patrol, where people who are living in the camp and who are already part of the MPP process, so people who have presented themselves at the bridge, have asked for asylum and have been turned back under the MPP and told to go back and await their American legal process in Mexico. For people who have been enrolled, if you will, into the MPP process, the UNHCR has been coordinating who, as of last Thursday, can be assisted with printing out the relevant paperwork and cleared with CBP to walk in groups of up to about 100 a day to cross at the bridge there in Brownsville. And since those folks are people who are pre-cleared, again, already in the process, beginning on Thursday, there were about 100 people that were walked across successfully. The same with Friday, the same with Saturday. And then on Sunday, she said approximately a little bit less than 100, but that's Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Sunday, more or less 400 people. But once those folks are processed, they are COVID tested before they're allowed to officially enter the US. And then once they are processed and allowed to walk out onto the American side, they board these buses, which then take the migrants to the Brownsville bus station, where the city of Brownsville is now administering a lot of the immediate response as far as having people coordinate how to help people get plane tickets or bus tickets to wherever it is that they're traveling to beyond the border. And that transportation is being handled by people's families, the families of the migrant. In the rare circumstance that there is someone who crosses that does not have any family that can help with the transportation, they have facilitated with donations that help someone get transportation out. But the city is at least coordinating there, and they have a relationship with a shelter there in Brownsville or two, where if people need to stay an evening because of difficulty in getting them transported out or contacting their family, they're able to do that, but that's at a different facility. Although she says most people don't stay overnight because they have advance notice when they've been pre-cleared, and there's communication with people in the camp about who's coming. And so you can kind of start working on that in advance. So according to Susan Law, one of the Angry Diaz and Abuelas, there are now less than 500 people in the camp, approximately. And she says that because they did do a census, but the numbers change so much on a daily basis. You know, new people arrive, some people are allowed to cross, some people who have been deported are popped out on the Mexican side and end up temporarily in the camp before they go someplace else. So there's a lot of flux. And she said, you know, of the 500 people that are still in the camp, it's difficult to say how many people really are in the MPP process. As I said, there are some people who are new migrants. There are some people who are people who have already lost the immigration process through the MPP protocol, lost their hearing, were never appointed a lawyer. And so one of the open questions is whether those people are going to be allowed to appeal, including if their appeal technically is considered untimely under existing immigration laws, if they want to get, you know, a more fair hearing and a more fair process via whatever process the Biden administration proposes to adopt in the future. And then, you know, there are some people like children who are born in the camp who just don't have a status at all. They haven't yet been dealt with. So there's a lot of flux. As I said, once people are inside the US, COVID testing is being done at the bridge, or if there are people who are crossing in other ways, so people who are not pre-cleared, they are doing COVID testing outside of the shelters before they admit people to the shelters. And as I said, in Brownsville, the city of Brownsville is coordinating this. And then in McAllen, the Catholic Charities organization is still coordinating with the Respite Center. And there are some opportunities for assistance. Locally in the RGV, they're looking for local volunteers who are bilingual. There's not as much need to help with food preparation because in Brownsville, for example, they have raised enough funds, including with Team Brownsville, that they have contracted with another nonprofit organization that is now doing the cooking there. So that's been a big help off of Team Brownsville as far as not having to serve, you know, hundreds of people each day. But the financial donations certainly help with that. And, you know, they have volunteers, if they're bilingual, that are helping people coordinate how to get to the airport. One of the reasons that Susan and I spoke today as opposed to yesterday was she was helping shuttle people back and forth to the airport or to the bus station. Things have been very hectic. But they are still seeking financial donations. She said donations both to Team Brownsville or to the Angry Tias and Abuelas would be useful, and they combine funds since they work on the same mission. So either one is appropriate, and I have the website info on where to make those donations a little bit a little bit later in the presentation. And they're not at this time asking for donations of material items like, clothing or food or water, things that they had requested in the past, because it's still difficult to get those through customs, and because they've found that they can purchase things more cheaply on the Mexican side when needed. So really it's local volunteers to assist with logistics, especially if they're bilingual, and then financial contributions. And I know that I'm actually almost already out of time, so I'll just put up here the info on how you can help. With respect to direct assistance to migrants, they are still looking for people to sponsor migrants. This is something that Jennifer Harbury explained to the congregation last time she and I spoke, including to the Amnesty group. In order for someone to be allowed out on bond, there needs to be someone who agrees to be financially responsible for them and to sponsor them, since they're not allowed to work while their case is pending. And that means that for up to 10 years, you agree to make sure that they have what they need to survive, such that they don't become what's called a public charge, basically such that they don't become a drain on taxpayer resources, like through the use of food stamps, which they're not even eligible for anyways. But there are a lot of people who may have had a sponsor, especially family members in the past, who don't have a sponsor anymore because their family member has passed because of the pandemic, or because so many people have become unemployed or have had their hours cut and don't meet the financial qualifications anymore. So they do have information on the Angry Tias and Abuelas website, which is right here, or on their Facebook page, about what it means to sponsor people. And they're looking for sponsors. And again, they're also looking for people who can make donations in the form of monetary contributions, or once migrants arrive in whatever community that they're going to settle in, to provide assistance to those migrants. This is not something that the folks here down in the RGV themselves are tracking as far as where people go, because it's overwhelming just to track people as they come in and to help them get across. But there are organizations, including refugee resettlement organizations in different parts of the country, that you may be able to reach out to see what can be done to help people in your community, especially since they can't work and so have very limited means. So the next thing that Jennifer said that folks, that Susan was discussing that folks could do is, if you're concerned about this issue, is to continue to ask questions of the Biden administration. It's not clear yet what their plan is for the new migrants, people who were born in camps, or people who have not yet applied under the MPP. It's clear that their focus right now is on dismantling the MPP and on allowing people to enter if they are pre-screened and not deemed a criminal risk. For example, they haven't had prior deportations, but that just sets the clock back to the pre-Trump administration. It doesn't really discuss what our response is to the waves of prospective refugees who are coming, nor does it revise immigration law or standards. So some of the questions that need to be answered are, what about those folks who can't appeal under the MPP, people who are already processed all the way through the legal system under those harsh conditions or legal restrictions and are not entitled to any remedies as the law stands now? For people who are still in the MPP, are they going to have more of a right to counsel? There's no right to counsel in our American immigration system. It's a civil issue. There's no right. You can have an attorney if you can afford one, but very few can. And then also what standards, if any, are going to be revised, like the standard for gender-based persecution, and whether or not that can still be considered ground for political asylum. Under the Trump administration, the Attorney General told all of the immigration judges, who are supervised by the Department of Justice, it's really weird, they're not independent in the immigration system, and they were told that gender-based violence is not a ground for asylum. And then you all may have heard in the news, the Immigration Judge Union is up in arms, and rightly so, about the number of cases that they're being told to adjudicate. They've had many judges resign because the quotas that the Trump administration was insisting upon did not allow for due process, and were requiring hearings of 30 minutes or less when people are talking about, severe issues with respect to prosecution and death that they have experienced already and may face at their return. So it's pretty inhumane, and those are all open issues still that have to be dealt with. So I think I'm over time now, and all these other issues about farm workers, which are super, super important and time sensitive, I may just wait for another invitation to address with you all, because I don't want to give the short shrift, and I want to give you all time for questions and answers based on
Daniela, you can speak until 7:15. That's okay.
okay.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, why don't we go ahead and speak? Okay, speak until then, and then we do the Q&A, or because I want to save time.
Just go ahead and speak till 7:15, and then we'll do Q&A. The guy from AI USA who was gonna come in to make some announcement, he just texted me he can't make it, so you can have his time.
Okay, great. I really appreciate that. Okay, so that's what's going on the Mexican side of the US-Mexico border, at least as far as here in the Rio Grande Valley is concerned. Meanwhile, back at home, there are lots of other issues that are going on with migrants here in Texas and in different parts of the country. And so it's very important that, we focus on having people have a right to access our system, and a right to come to the US where our immigration system allows it. But once people are here, unfortunately, the system isn't much more just. So we've been working on a lot of issues that impact people irrespective of their immigration status once they start working in low wage industries, which of course has become very, very dangerous during the pandemic. So I just wanted to go over a few things once again about what our organization does. In the department that I supervise, we do a lot of community education and outreach to migrant and seasonal farm workers, people that work in agriculture. Typically, we visit them in the migrant labor camps where they live, which is often on employer-provided property. So our ability to access them is restricted and difficult, much like it is with the camp there in Matamoros. We do represent people in federal and in state court. We do some legislative advocacy. We're a little bit restricted in our ability to do that as a 501c3, but we do have a lot of conversations with legislators at their request about what good legislation would be for farm workers, and try and monitor bad legislation and testify against it when we're asked. And then of course we give a lot of advice to other organizations, legal advice and support, including for some of the organizations that are involved on the NPP issues that we just discussed. So just as an overview, you all might have seen in the news that COVID-19 is something that has really decimated the agricultural community and the meatpacking community. And so, for example, up in Cactus, Texas, which is about an hour and 15 minutes north of Amarillo, back in May, there was a huge outbreak at one of the meatpacking plants, JBS Swift. And at the same time, there was also a huge outbreak at the Tyson plant, which is located in Amarillo, which led to the Texas Department of State Health Services actually going into those plants, which employ several thousand workers, and insisting on testing workers by the hundreds, and the communities surrounding them became national hotspots. There were also numerous deaths of meat packers in different states. And in Texas, industry really was not policed or shut down in any way. In fact, we currently represent a worker at Cactus who got sick because the person whose locker was immediately next to him and immediately next to him on the line got COVID, and the employer wasn't screening for that at the time, refused to inform other workers that there was this COVID outbreak. So we've been working a lot on the meat packer situation. There were two very good articles that came out in the New Yorker in May and June on this issue that we contributed to and that are worth reading. And then in the farm worker community, they're especially in places where there's congregate housing, where workers are housed together with many people. There have been large outbreaks, mass sickness of 30, 40, 50, 60, if not more workers at a time who've contracted COVID, and especially up in the Panhandle in Dalhart, Texas, the northwest corner of the Panhandle. In September, we were responding to lots and lots of calls from migrant workers from Mexico on visas who were catching COVID because they lived in shipping containers with 6 to 30 other workers, some of whom had strokes as a result. We have a client that had to have a lung replacement. And there's a very compelling article that you all can find in the Texas Observer from September of 2020 that talks about a guest worker, an H-2A worker by the name of Marco Antonio Galvan, who unfortunately died in July in the middle of a COVID outbreak on that farm. So we represent his estate, and we filed a lawsuit against the farm for gross negligence due to failure to respond by taking him to medical care and providing him that transportation once they knew that he was sick, given that the employer was obligated to do that as an H-2A worker who lived on their premises. And so on the COVID issue, there is a letter that's being drafted by the National Center for Farm Worker Health. And it's a sign-on letter to the state of Texas, because unfortunately, Texas is one of 7 states in the country that when they developed their protocols for vaccinations, as far as who's in tier 1 versus others, did not include farm workers in any of the priority tiers. So there's, a national recognition that people who are essential workers, especially people that work in agriculture in close confines, like in the packing sheds or processing centers, or people who work in congregate housing camps, migrant camps, need to be vaccinated. And unfortunately, Texas is one of 7 states that has not included them as a priority category. So if people are interested, I can send you information about that sign-on letter, which is being drafted now and should go out in the next 1 to 2 weeks to encourage mobile vaccination clinics and pilot projects for migrants put on by the state to try and get people vaccinated. We have been responding to disaster relief issues also. I mean, it's literally one thing after another. So, as we all know, 2 weeks ago, there was a natural disaster. There's been quite a lot of damage to agriculture down here in the Rio Grande Valley. It's wiped out a lot of the citrus crop here. And up in the Panhandle, for example, we're hearing that a lot of people that worked in dairies have been affected because like the hay and sorghum and things that are grown for feed have been impacted. So the people involved in the hauling of that or in feeding animals are not employed as much. And of course, we had heard before during the pandemic that orders for farms were down because not as many people were eating at restaurants or because schools had closed, and so they didn't have as much of a demand. And so we have started exploring what the rules are going to be for Texas disaster unemployment assistance. So that's unemployment assistance beyond just regular unemployment assistance, but special eligibility for people who are impacted by the disaster. And we're going to do community education on that over the next month. And then we're also exploring what people in other states have done to develop private relief funds for people with no eligibility, for example, for stimulus relief payments, since people who lack lawful immigration status, or even people who file a joint return with a family member who does not have lawful immigration status, have been left out of all of the stimulus payments. It's a huge, huge hole. And so we're exploring pandemic relief fund models and individual foundation or private donations to see if we can get some kind of a relief fund going for migrants affected by the disaster or by the pandemic if they weren't eligible for the meager stimulus funds or not eligible for unemployment. And then, as I mentioned, there are going to be some bills that are coming up in the Texas legislature. These are the same bills that for the last 3 sessions have been sponsored but have not passed. But, you know, folks will keep trying. And so these are bills I know that Bob, for example, and Albert Gonzalez had been active in helping with the first time around that they were filed. But by way of context, in the Austin American Statesman back in 2016, there were a series of articles that talked about how poorly the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs, the TDHCA, has administered their farm labor housing licensing and inspection program over the last, say, 10 years now. And that agency has improved somewhat, but there is an omnibus reform bill, for example, that puts in criteria and quotas that insists that they do in-camp inspections. And one of the issues that we've been dealing with most recently through administrative litigation is with another state agency, the Texas Workforce Commission, which deals with H-2A workers in housing. And we sued them because they were approving camp permits for people that said that they were getting their water tested to show that it met standards, when in reality, no one was submitting any information for water testing. They were just checking off that box. And we're talking about 400 employers, some with multiple housing units. So there was no enforcement of the water quality controls in farm labor housing, which is especially serious because people who live alongside farms, for example, are subject to nitrate poisoning from fertilizer in the water, or who live in high concentrations, especially if they're on well water. So it's not water that's publicly or regularly tested, and who also have a septic, have a lot of leaching issues. So all of the same, you know, water quality issues that you typically see, say, in a camp in Matamoros or in a camp in another country are going on in farm worker housing here in Texas. And our administrative litigation has forced the agency to start insisting that actual water results be provided. So keep an eye out for that, as well as a legislative budget appropriation rider, which has actually passed the last few seasons, but needs to be renewed every session. And that is to allow the TDHCA, that state licensing agency, to continue to be able to receive the revenues from license applications and to earmark that back for the program for licensing and inspecting farm labor housing, as opposed to those fees going back into the general revenue. So that's been a severely underfunded program for many, many years. And those revenues, especially as more and more people are told that they need to get a license, are what are going to sustain that effort, because the legislature thus far has not specifically earmarked funding for that project, apart from the usage of those licensing fees.
Okay.
So the final comment I have here is just that we have also started doing a lot of data gathering. We've developed an outreach map, and in the outreach map, it plots where, based on what we know and using federally available data, where all of the farm workers in Texas are living and working. And we actually overlaid that with a COVID map that pulls information on a daily basis from the Texas Department of State Health Services and also from Johns Hopkins. And that's helped us with outreach planning. because we've all been working remotely, and we don't want to give COVID to people who are in vulnerable populations or period, and we don't want to catch COVID ourselves either. And so that's been useful too for tracking trends. I mean, you could see that the meatpacking plants were the source of outbreaks, because you could look from one day to the next and see just doubling and quintupling of exposures in the immediate area there. So we've been doing a lot of litigation around the pandemic and the impact that that's had on workers, and then also all of the pre-pandemic litigation that we typically do on wage non-payment, people who are trafficked, people who are discriminated against with respect to their race or their gender. It's been a lot. So there are some other case examples which you can kind of flip through in this PowerPoint, but I know that I'm over time. But I'll open it up for questions to the extent that there's time. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all about this, because I know you've been active on these issues before.
Thank you, Daniela. So folks who has question, unmute yourself and ask your question. We have 10 more minutes left, and I have a couple of announcements after the Q&A.
Daniela, how many inspectors are there now?
Okay, that is an excellent question. So there are two agencies that are involved. There's the Texas Workforce Commission, and they do the pre-occupancy inspections for the H-2A workers. Those are the workers brought in from other countries to work in agriculture. And then there is the TDHCA, which is the state agency that's supposed to enforce the state standards that we have, so over and above the federal standards. And neither of those agencies, Leslie, have inspectors that are specifically designated to inspect farm worker housing or farm labor housing. The TDHCA has inspectors from another division, their mobile home division, that are detailed out to do the state inspections when someone applies for a license. But last I heard, there were, I want to say, no more than 7 for the whole state with the TDHCA. And again, that's not their primary duty. Their primary duty is to inspect mobile homes throughout the state of Texas. And then for the TWC, they do have some inspectors, but I want to say it's less than 5. And so the Statesman expose, which is the first session in 2016, when this issue really started getting hot in the legislature, showed the amount of money that was spent on farm worker housing in Texas in comparison to other states, and in comparison to what Texas agriculture brings in this state versus in other states. And we are the 3rd largest farm worker state in the country, California, Florida, Texas. And that's part of why it's just ridiculous that we don't have a COVID protocol for farm workers either. And in 2016, when they did that article, they found that the TDHCA agency, the state agency, spent a total of $2,500 in their farm labor housing inspection program. Total. Whereas the state of Michigan, which has about placed 10th or so in number of farm workers and has less revenues, and they spent over 250,000. I want to say it was maybe around 400,000. And as a result, they have much better housing. So there's no one specific that's dedicated to work on that issue. They have some people that are detailed, but it's, you know, less than 15. And I don't know what amount of time they actually spend doing that versus all the other things. We probably need to file a Public Information Act to get down to that.
If you can access, I'm talking to the rest of the people, if you can access that excellent Austin American Statesman series there, please do, because it went, I think I know it came into the Chronicle, and I think it went to every major newspaper in the state.
Yes.
And Daniela, myself, and Leslie, and some other people, Albert, were involved in here, going to meetings on Austin about this, and it's just an atrocious situation. You
right.
Yeah.
I'll post this in the chat. It was a 3-part series, and it's better if you view this online because they had a lot of interactive tools here. But it was called Unlivable and really gets into the history of that. So I will say that things have greatly improved in that just with that bill that passed the first legislative session, by allowing the fees for inspection applications to go back into the licensing program, I think that it resulted in 10 times the revenue, ergo 10 times the resources expended for the licensing project, just by the passage of that one budget appropriation. But when you're dealing with $2,500, it's pretty easy to say, well, we increased funding by 10 times and it's still, nowhere near appropriate. So it's been an uphill battle. But I think now is the time really to start thinking about these issues because, we started out this meeting with a conversation about how difficult it's been for people to not have electricity or water and, people whose homes have been devastated, which of course is terrible. But we have people living in the Matamoros camp in conditions like that daily. Conditions are better than they were certainly when things first started happening in 2014, 2015, but still going on. And then here on the Texas side, we have people who have non-potable water. If they have water that's provided to them, because again, that's never been actually looked at by the inspectors, or maybe they run the tap, but pay no attention to whether it's discolored or whether it has, other hazardous content. So I think the sensitivity now, especially with people talking about, supporting essential workers, may be different this session than in the past. There are certainly more people who are attuned in a personal way to these difficulties. It's still majority Republican legislature, and we don't live in a state where people want to spend money, but some of these issues don't really require the legislature to spend money, like, insisting that these agencies actually enforce what's on the inspection checklist doesn't require them to spend money. The person who's providing the housing needs to go out and get the test. And they can afford it because they're employing, multiples of workers, and ag is a huge industry here.
Anybody else have any questions for Daniela?
One of the things that no one has
Thank
a
you.
question-
Thank you very much, Daniela. This was really informative.
No?
Well, one of the things before she goes, they were talking about the farm workers there in these articles, and they were the state was paying atrocious amounts and approving places where these folks could stay, and they were living on dirt floors, and a whole bunch of people, rats were there. It is worse than anything that I could have ever imagined. And it really touched us. And Daniela, if I could ask you to maybe send Mohammed and myself the bills that you would like for us to get active on, I would appreciate it, because we will write letters and make phone calls.
Okay,
Yeah,
great. I will follow up with the info on the Texas bills, and then also with the link to the sign-on letter regarding the tier priority for COVID and the request to the state for pilot vaccination clinics.
Thank you.
No, thank
I
you
had a
all.
question. Are the sign-on letters quite effective? Would it be helpful to get our friends and others to sign them?
Anyone is open to signing on. It's still being drafted. It's being revised by people. I hope by the end of the week to get the content from the people who are spearheading it at the National Center for Farm Worker Health, which thankfully is based in Buda, Texas, just south of Austin, of all places. So they've been very, very helpful on this issue, including with the outbreaks that were happening up in the Panhandle this fall. They were doing their own contact tracing amongst the farm worker community when the state or the CDC